The story of Nathan Algren was inspired by a real historical figure, the Frenchman Jules Brunet, and it takes place around the 1870s. Nathan is introduced like this, a lost drunk, a war hero who became a poster boy for a weapons company. He now makes a living by giving presentations on stages at conventions and fairs, where he tells romanticized stories about his battles in the Indian Wars and the American Civil War to attract buyers for the new rifles. That's how he earns his money and survives. But even though that's his livelihood, he clearly hates not only his job and the people he works for, but also the person he's become. A mere product of his environment, a guy who followed orders on autopilot, did everything for money and reputation, took part in massacres against indigenous people, children, women, and completely lost himself in the process. He can't sleep at night, he lives in anguish, and above all, he seems to feel disgusted with his own life. And drinking seems to be the only anesthesia he's found to cope with all of this. Clearly, there's no more spark or meaning in his life, but even so, because of his prestige in the military, there are still people interested in hiring him. That's what we see happening at the beginning of the movie. The Japanese politician Omura makes a deal with the American government to hire military specialists. Among them are Captain Nathan Algren, who is invited to train the Imperial Japanese Army. And, in exchange for the military training, Omura promised advantageous trade deals to the United States, guaranteeing the opening of Japan to the press.
E produtos americanos. Quanto a Nathan,
He'll get a good amount of money in return.
We will pay you $400 a month.
They want Nathan to teach soldiers on the other side of the world to fight like Westerners, with firearms, more modern tactics, and the much-admired American military culture. Japan is trying to modernize to compete with the major powers. And the United States, of course, sees a huge profit opportunity there to sell weapons and make new trade deals. Each one has their own interests. And Nathan, as always, takes it for the money. He doesn't care if he has to kill more men.
Do you want me to change Japan? Me kill Japan. Do you want me to change Japan's enemies? I will kill Japan's enemies. For $500 a month, I'll kill whoever you want.
With that spirit, he goes to Japan. Upon arriving, he sees a divided country. Japan was going through a period of transition. It was the beginning of the Meiji era. The old samurai era, after several centuries, was coming to an end. The samurais were the guardians of the emperor and the people. But now, they are seen by many as an obstacle to progress, a regime that is preventing Japan from growing and becoming one of the world's major powers. So, the new government wants to replace the samurai swords with firearms, and all those traditions with Western efficiency. The samurais obviously do not agree. They aim to preserve the honor, culture, and traditions that have shaped Japan for centuries. So they rebel against the new modernizing government. This is the movie's conflict. And Nathan is on the side of the new Japan. He's the captain who will train and lead this very well-armed army. But then, as soon as he arrives on the very first day of training, he realizes that despite all the firepower they have, he's facing extremely unprepared soldiers. But who said their leaders care about that? They don't want to waste any more time. They want to win this conflict quickly and finally free Japan from the backwardness that the samurai represent. And that's why, even against his will, Nathan is forced to follow orders and march to the battlefield. Their leaders think that with all this firepower, with all the rifles and cannons, the samurais wouldn't stand a chance. After all, they still used old weapons like swords and arrows and refused to modernize. Their tradition doesn't allow the use of firearms, and they respected that a lot. For them, the sword was the soul of the warrior, a sacred symbol of honor, and the way you fight is just as important as the reason you fight. So into the showdown we go, and guess what happens? Exactly what Nathan predicted, a quick and humiliating massacre. The new Japanese army is destroyed in minutes, but Nathan is one of the few who holds out. He doesn't run away at all. Even wounded and surrounded, he keeps on fighting. This moment is strange. In the middle of 19th century Japan, a foreign man in a battle that has nothing to do with him, alone, surrounded by dozens of samurai, fighting with courage and anger like someone who has nothing left to lose. That's exactly what catches Katsumoto's attention. The samurai leader sees something different in him. And that's why, instead of delivering the final blow, he orders that he be taken alive to the village as a prisoner of war. He wanted to understand and study his new enemy better. Nathan is then taken. He wakes up in an isolated village in the middle of the mountains, in a Japanese community. But even though he's a prisoner of war, he's treated with respect and care that's not at all common for a prisoner. He's even staying at the house of the widow of the samurai he himself had just killed in battle. And worse, it's she who takes care of him, who feeds him, in her own house in front of her children. This is a shock for Nathan. How could someone who lost her husband to him still show such compassion and dignity? It wasn't just how they treated enemies that stood out, but also how they handled death and life overall.
I killed her husband.
It was a good death.
It was a completely different world, but little by little he starts to see that those men weren't as savage as people said. The guys had values, were disciplined to an incredible degree, loyal, and lived with a lot of honor and courage. And that starts to affect him, makes him begin to question if his world is really the civilized one, if his world is really the right one to follow.
Continue to live among these unusual people. They are an intriguing people. From the moment they wake, they devote themselves to the perfection of whatever they pursue. I have never seen such discipline.
In that village, Nathan begins to understand the true meaning of community. Not that empty meaning that his world keeps trying to sell, where in practice it's just a bunch of people sharing a space and pretending to connect, while each one is only worried about themselves. But there, he sees an effort where one truly supports the other. What is done has a meaning greater than one's own ego. And it's there, in the midst of that lifestyle that his world would call backward and outdated, that he seems to reconnect with the essence of things, with a part of life that he had already completely lost touch with.
I know that it's here that I had my first peaceful sleep in many years.
He starts to find a bit of peace of mind. He follows their routine, watches the samurai training, and begins to understand what drives them. Soldiers who fight for the honor of serving the emperor and their people, not for material goods or power. For them, glory goes far beyond recognition from others or money.
I'm surprised that samurai means to serve, and that Katsumoto believes his rebellion must be in service to the emperor.
He starts to integrate, becomes part of the community, and is trained by his enemies. He learns to handle the sword and to control his own mind.
No mind. No mind.
His identification with and admiration for those people becomes evident. And in the midst of this cultural clash, he is transformed internally. Something inside him that seemed dead for years begins to awaken. The ability to love, to feel, to simply be present in the moment. Nathan is deeply affected by his relationship with Taka, the widow who cares for him. The purity in her gestures, coming from someone who would have the most reasons to hate him, breaks down everything he believed about human beings. Because in his world, everything has some ulterior motive behind it. But not there. For the first time in a long time, he's in a place where things seem to make sense without needing an explanation all the time. Where life just happens.
I've never been a church-going man, and what I have seen on the field of battle has led me to question God's purpose. But there is indeed something spiritual in this place.
But then, after several months living in the village, the time comes to leave. Nathan needs to be returned to the enemies of the samurai, to the army he was training. And then he is taken by the samurai back to the city. And it's at this moment that we see one of the most iconic scenes of the movie, the clash between the two worlds, between the old and the new. And it's clear by Nathan's look and expression that he no longer belongs to the world that hired him. Back, even after receiving a financially irresistible offer to lead the Japanese army and destroy the samurai, he refuses. Money can't buy him anymore. Now he has something greater to fight for. So he not only escapes from there, but also risks his own life to save Katsumoto and return to the village to prepare for the final battle alongside the samurai. He had no obligation to fight. That wasn't even his war. It wasn't his country nor his people. But it was there that he found something the whole world couldn't give him. That place gave him his life back. Together, we'll make the emperor listen to you. Together in the final war, led by Nathan and Katsumoto, the samurai fight bravely even under extremely unfavorable conditions, both in terms of the number of soldiers and firearms. They resist with honor, but they know that defeat is certain. They just prefer to die faithful to their principles than to live without a soul. The samurai fall one by one. Nathan and Katsumoto are gunned down by the army's new technological weapons. Both of them know it's the end. Katsumoto is dying and asks Nathan for one last gesture of honor, to die by his own sword. They lose the battle but leave a message for the Emperor. Any progress without soul is destruction. As for Nathan, we don't really know what happened to him after the battle. Some say he didn't survive his wounds and died. Others say he returned to his country of origin. But the narrator of the story likes to imagine that he returned to the village, to the only place where, after everything, he found a bit of peace. As I mentioned, this story does have some basis in reality. The French military officer Julius Rimet, in real life, was also sent to Japan around that same time to train the troops of the military government. When the French mission was ordered to leave, Brunet refused to return to France and chose to fight with the samurai against imperial forces in the Boshin War. So yes, just like in the movie, he also lived among the samurai and shared their values. Of course, they romanticized his whole story quite a bit. But that's not the most important thing. What really moves us is understanding all the symbolism behind Nathan's journey of transformation. In the beginning, the guy represents a lot of people who live without energy, with depression, anxiety, anguish, without seeing any meaning in life. And a lot of people already treat this as something normal, as a natural part of life, as if the problem was your inability to adapt to reality, and not the reality you are choosing to live in. And then what does the solution become? To adjust. Take medicine to endure the unbearable, distract yourself, drink, overload yourself with stimulation, anything that relieves the symptom, but without addressing the cause. And that's where the mistake comes in. Because as Albert Einstein used to say, you can't solve a problem by thinking the same way you did when you created it. And that's exactly what we do. We try to fix our own lives from the same state of mind that left them this way. And to help you understand this crazy talk, let's think of the mind in 3 levels, in 3 states of consciousness. The first dimension is where most people are. It's autopilot. It's when you wake up, do what you have to do, react to whatever comes up without even really noticing why. It's living shaped by the environment. The second dimension already seems like an evolution. It's when you start to understand the game. You start to gain more power, more money, more status, and then you improve your life, achieve things. But even so, you're still limited by this game. And that's why, even when things work out, a lot of people still feel empty. Even being successful, very rich and famous, they still need medication to cope with life, living in anguish. And Nathan lived his whole life within these 2 dimensions. He had already been the guy who just followed orders and did everything for money. And later he became a more respected, more valued guy. But even so, that didn't mean anything to him. And the worst part is that when you spend too much time inside this square and finite world that society pressures us to live in, you start to think it's all there is. And because of that, even when nothing in this world fulfills you, you don't even think about questioning it anymore. So the only alternative left is to start numbing yourself to it. It's like what Nathan did. He didn't go looking for something different. He just got drunk and did anything just so he wouldn't have to deal with the anguish and emptiness he felt in this life. But his capture breaks that. He's forcibly torn from his world and his reality. And that moment, to me, symbolizes a man swallowing his ego. There, everything he believed himself to be, the war hero, the captain, all of that was gone. He becomes a prisoner, a nobody in an unknown world. And that's when he leaves the environment that defined who he is. He leaves the world that taught him to fight for empty things. And it's at this point that the change begins. Because when you leave the context that shaped you, you start to see things with new eyes. Things that once seemed normal stop making sense. Beliefs that once seemed solid start to lose their strength. And you finally begin to truly question your world and your reality. In this process, he discovers what I call a 3rd dimension of consciousness. A very rare state, but essential in our lives. This is the state of transformation, where you stop living on autopilot. You stop pretending all the time. And finally, you start to see life with a clarity that simply didn't exist before. And don't fall into that simplistic idea that this only happened because he went to the East and started meditating, as if Eastern culture were something sacred, as if it were better than ours. That's not the point. The point behind all of this is expanding your perspective. Transformation comes when the ego is displaced from the territory where it feels safe, when your reality is shattered and you're forced to face what you were avoiding. Almost no one truly goes through this. And when they do go through it, they try to run back to what they know. Nathan was pushed into this. There was no way for him to escape, and at first he even resisted. He rejected it. He tried to stay the same. But little by little, he stops fighting it and opens up. And that's when everything changes. Because if there's one thing I believe, it's that life always offers what the soul needs, but almost never in the way the ego wants. That's why we tend to reject change, because the ego, in an attempt to protect you, makes you afraid. It pulls you back to what's comfortable, to what's familiar, to where you feel in control again. And we easily give in. We close ourselves off and keep living the same way. And that's what gets to me. Because deep down, you know something is wrong, but you don't change, because you don't allow yourself to go further. While the ego seeks protection, the soul seeks growth. And these two forces are always in conflict inside us. The ego wants to keep you safe, and the soul wants to keep you truly alive. And even though we look at this and immediately want to blame the ego as if it's all its fault, that's not true, because it's not the ego's fault. It's about how we use it. We usually think that the purpose of the ego is restrictive, but the truth is that it can also be expansive. It should be a tool in our lives, a bridge between who you are inside and the world outside, but we turn it into a wall. We train it to avoid the unknown, to reject what doesn't fit into our worldview, to keep everything under control. And it's no wonder our lives don't change. And that's why I say that exploration in this process is what helps us grow, because without confrontation, without displacement, without breaking the pattern, there is no transformation. Life can even take you to unlikely places. Just like it took Nathan, completely lost, to a Japanese community in the middle of nowhere. And it was right there, in a place he would never have chosen, living in a way he had never considered, that he found his peace. And more than that, he found meaning for his own life. Nathan's journey really moves me because I went through something similar in my own way. I turned these ideas and reflections into a 10-episode series with over 5 hours of content. Click the video on the screen and I'll explain everything.